Started. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Torah Studies. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you join me tonight for some incredible Torah study. We are going to explore our Torah portion, Mishpatim, and you know about the parsha, Mishpatim? All right, so we're gonna learn some more stuff tonight. We're gonna explore.
Today.
Okay, we're gonna explore Mishpatim and hopefully walk away with just some deeper understanding of some Torah concepts and some relevant personal messages, all coming up tonight at Torah Studies. Okay, so let me tell you a story. This story goes back, I want to say about, hold on, let me think. It is not probably, I want to say like a little under 2 years ago. And I got a call from Chabad.org. You know, the website Chabad.org, the big central mothership website. Okay. Chabad.org gives me a call and says, hey, we have these courses, these online courses. We know they do a lot of teaching, and we'd love for you to teach a course for Chabad.org. And I said, sure, what's the topic? They gave me a topic. And then they sent a film crew and they came to Chabad in town, to the new building. And we shot the 4-part series in the shul in the synagogue. And they edited and whatever, and they posted it. And it's now available on Chabad.org and you can enjoy it. And honestly, I hate to say this, I don't remember the name of the course that they gave it. I know what the topic was, but after we shot it, they gave a name to it and they marketed it and they branded it, whatever it is. But it's there. Does anybody remember when that happened at the time about that course? Yes? If you don't, it's okay. It's all right. After all, I don't remember the name of the course that they called it. But the point is that when they shot it in the new synagogue space, there was a major part of why it took so much time was not actually the teaching. Like each class was supposed to be, I think, 30 minutes per class. I wanted to keep it about 30 minutes, I think. So each class is about 30 minutes. We did it in one take. But it took like a few hours to do it. And you might know, you probably can guess what took so long. What took so long in the whole operation? What do you think? What do you think? If the class only took me 30 minutes to teach, so what do you think took so much time? Let's say the whole thing was like 2 hours, 2.5 hours. What do you think took all the time? Jump in, unmute yourself.
Setting up the video and the audio and all of the other equipment and running electricity, because if you had just moved in, things were not finished out and you didn't have all the electrical and the lighting that you have now. Well,
good. So actually the electrical was up. The room was pretty much, we didn't have the lights as we have now, but the cameras and the mics and the lighting, that took a long time. But you know what else took a long time?
Your joke.
What else took a long time was the props. And when I say props, I mean kind of like the decor of how they wanted to set up the room. So it's not like, oh, step into the synagogue, pull over in front of the chairs or the whatever, the rows and we'll shoot. No, not so simple. They cleared it and they took a lamp from the lobby and put it in on a table in the corner and a chair at that angle, another chair at the other angle in the background. When they soften it, create a soft background. This whole thing about exactly where things should be positioned. It's an art. It's literally an art to design a space so that it looks appealing for the camera. And you can, you go to Chabad.org, not now, you can do it later. Don't double dip with classes. It could be hazardous. No, I'm kidding. Staging, thank you, Donna. We call this staging in English, yes. So it's staging, and it was an art. It's about where things should be in proximity to other things. Like relative to me sitting in a chair, where should another chair? Where should a lamp? Where should a fern? Whatever, where should all this stuff be? That's part of the chachma of design. And I will tell you that the videographer and the other person that was there, the producer, he did a great job with all the stuff. It's a beautifully shot video. The content, I think, is also okay, but the video, it's like the quality and the look is really gorgeous. Okay, why am I saying this? Because if in videography, if it's true that in videography, proximity matters, what you put near something else is intentional and matters, and it's not random, it's not haphazard, it's by design. If that's true in videography, if the chevra that Chabad.org sent to Chabad in town a year and a half, 2 years ago, are so precise in what follows what and what goes next to the other, then you think that God had some precision when God wrote the Torah? I think so, right? If human beings are precise when we organize things, certainly God has organized the Torah with absolute precision, which, as you might imagine, brings me to our conversation of this week's Torah portion. You see, last week on Torah studies, we spoke about the Torah portion of Yisro. And Yisro, in addition to Yisro, the father-in-law of Moses, joining the Jewish people in the desert, converted to Judaism, etc. In addition to that, last week, we read in the Torah portion about the 10 Commandments, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, divine revelation, that big moment that happened 7 weeks after the Exodus, in which God conveyed the instruction manual for life to the Jewish people. This is what happened in last week's Torah portion. And so what this week's Torah portion discusses, especially the opening of this week's Torah portion, is highly significant. Let me explain. The Torah portion that immediately follows the episode at Sinai, you would imagine, has significance. It's not like we just had Sinai, this incredible moment, this incredible gift, this incredible revelation, this incredible declaration, and now, yeah, we'll just, whatever happens next happens next. No, everything is staged, to use the term that Donna mentioned. Everything is staged with absolute, immaculate, intentional, divine precision. And so the narrative of our Torah portion, especially the opening narrative of our Torah portion, is not just the opening of this Torah portion. It is connected with last week's conversation. Is what I'm saying, does what I'm saying make sense? You understand what I'm saying? Yes? Juxtaposition. You will find commentaries. The Baal Turim is one of them. Baal Turim is a commentary that does a lot of numerology, but something else that he does is juxtapositions. He talks about why the connection between the last few words of one Torah portion and the first few words of the next Torah portion. He'll talk about how, even though there are different Torah portions, you might say, oh, listen, one chapter closes and the next chapter begins, and, different weeks, keep them separate. He says, no. One leads to the next, and one is informed by the next. And we're going to do a similar activity tonight, or exercise tonight, and that is analyze the connection between last week's portion, specifically the episode at Sinai, and this week's Torah portion, the beginning of Mishpatim and its opening law. So in order to do this, we need to look at how this Torah portion begins, because we know what happened last week. Revelation, 10 Commandments, that we got. But how does this week's Torah portion open? I'm glad you asked. We're going to do this together. All right, I am sharing my screen with you because, as you and I know, and as Riva knows, sharing is what? Caring. Why are you whispering? Love you. Okay. Oh, you're eating. That's so good. Okay, good. I'm glad you're whispering that. And not. All right, let's do this. Let's talk about the first mitzvah of this week's Torah portion. This is how Mishpatim opens up. Text number 1. Dr. Maxey, please get us started.
Should you buy a Hebrew slave, he must work for 6 years, and in the 7th year, he will be liberated without charge. But if the slave says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free, his master will bring him before the judges and bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master will bore his ear with an awl, and he will then serve him forever.
All right, thank you. There's a lot that needs to be unpacked from this reading. There's a lot that needs to be explored, including, of course, okay, There you go. The juxtaposition that we talked about before. But let's first deal with the verse itself, the verses themselves. It's a series of verses here. So the Torah opens up, this week's Torah portion opens up with a mitzvah, with a discussion about slaves. And it talks about how if you have a slave, then the max amount of time that you can have a slave is for 6 years. After 6 years, the 7th year, which is an objective 7-year cycle. So on that 7-year cycle, in the 7th year, the slave goes free. But if the slave chooses to remain a slave, the slave says, I actually don't want to go free. I like what I'm doing. I like working for this family or this person. So then the ear is pierced, and that slave serves the master forever, which our sages tell us is not actually literally forever, but it means until Yovel, until the Jubilee year, which is the 50th year. So that's the opening mitzvah of our Torah portion. If I summarize it, it would be the law of slaves in Judaism. One thing I need to mention off the bat is when we hear the word slavery, so we have to be careful. It's not exactly the same idea of slavery as you and I know it. In the Jewish understanding, slavery is not exactly slavery. It's not that you can't harm or abuse or, God forbid, injure a slave. It is essentially a form of, I don't know, live-in service, but it is not the same as slavery. I just want to clarify that. What does that say? Adina Malka is asking the question, can a female slave also go free? Yes, it would be the same. It's not gender exclusive. It would be the same for male and for male and female slaves. So what's the point? The point is the Torah is talking about slaves and giving kind of a time limit, 6 years, yes, but 7th year not. If the slave still chooses to be a slave, then it goes until 50 years. And then in the 50th year, the slave is free. Again, it doesn't mean the 50th year from when the slave first becomes a slave. There's an objective 50-year cycle. So it could be that the slave went into service as a slave in year 40 of the cycle, which means it would only be another 9 years or so until that 50th, or 10 years until the 50th year hit. Be that as it may, this is the opening mitzvah of our Torah portion. And I will tell you that if you find this mitzvah a little bit unusual, or maybe a little bit uncomfortable, you're not alone. And the commentaries pointed out, and really that will serve as the foundation of our 4 questions. These are not the Passover 4 questions. We'll leave that for another time. That's coming up soon. But I have 4 questions on this opening verse, or these opening verses, really the opening mitzvah of the Torah portion of Mishpatim. And again, to reiterate what I said before, the questions that we're going to ask on these verses that we just read are magnified by the fact that this is the very first mitzvah of the portion that immediately follows the episode, the experience at Sinai. Now, Sinai was just a grand, spiritual, just incredible, breathtaking experience. You would think that the first Torah portion right after Sinai, the first mitzvah, the first sit down, all right, folks, here's what we got. Here are the laws. The first thing would be something inspiring, something, I don't know, something that's like, that lifts the spirits. What do we have instead? We have a discussion about slavery. It's a discussion about Jewish slaves. Seems very, very strange on multiple levels. What? Seems strange. On multiple means on many levels. And so I want to share with you, you're thumbs downing it, right? Well, not exactly thumbs downing, but at least asking the question. So let's ask the question on 4 different levels, 4 different questions, and let's jump right in. Question number 1.
I think I'm going to get it.
Okay, question number 1 is, it seems like this topic would be highly triggering for the people that are being taught this mitzvah, right? It seems a bit sensitive. The first mitzvah after Sinai. I feel like I need to elaborate on this once again. I know I gave an introduction about it, but I feel like I need to give one more piece of information. The Jews were slaves in Egypt. They were then freed by God, and they travel through the desert for 7 weeks, anticipating getting ready to receive the Torah at Sinai. They got the Torah at Sinai, and what's the first thing that's communicated after that? The first thing is laws about slaves. Could we think of another topic, perhaps? Like, why again with the slavery? It seems a bit insensitive. You have a bunch of people that had just gotten out of slavery, and now you're telling them about slavery. It seems like, why go there? Especially, why go there right after Sinai, which is such an uplifting, liberating experience? Why go back to a conversation about slavery? It seems, frankly, insensitive, triggering. You know, they have trigger warnings now. It's trigger warning. We're going to talk about slavery. You're dealing with a bunch of slaves, a bunch of 7-week post-slavery former slaves. You're talking about the first thing has to be slavery. You can't smuggle it in somehow in the middle of the parsha, in the middle of the Torah portion. It has to be the opening shot. Yeah. After Sinai, the opening shot of Mishpatim, this Torah portion is boom. Let's talk about slavery. Are you kidding me?
What?
That's question number one. Question number two. Question number two is, in addition to it seeming to be insensitive, moreover, this mitzvah is completely irrelevant. Let me explain why it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant because Jewish slavery was only a thing when somebody was so impoverished. I mentioned this, by the way, when we studied these verses at Daily Power Parsha on Monday, which, by the way, Kan HaMakim, now is the time and the place to plug and give a bit of a 30-second commercial for Daily Power Parsha. You can join any day of the week that you'd like, 12 p.m., 12 noon, Daily Power Parsha. We go through the daily Torah reading. It's a wonderful experience, and we have some of you that are here tonight join us regularly or semi-regularly for that. And if you haven't yet, definitely jump in on that. It is awesome. Commercial closed, cut. All right, back to our regularly scheduled programming. No, it hasn't. So getting back to our regular scheduled programming. So the mitzvahs regarding slavery, this discussion is completely irrelevant because slaves, as we discussed the Daily Power Parsha, Jewish slavery only happened when a person became so impoverished that the only way they could repay their loan, the only way they could get out of debt was to work in a very focused way, kind of basically full time in this context of slavery. That's the only context in which slavery was permitted, was to pay off a pretty severe debt. And so the question is, why mention the laws of slavery at this time when we know that the Jewish people were very wealthy? Now, unmute yourself if you know the answer to this question. The question is, how did the Jewish people, having just been slaves, become very wealthy? And how did they become wealthy? Help me out.
They took all the gold and silver and the things that Hashem commanded them to take with them out of Egypt from the Egyptians.
Exactly. Right as the 9th and 10th plagues were going down, God tells Moses to tell the people, by the way, FYI, go around and start borrowing clay kesef, clay zav, silver and gold objects. And borrow, is used a little bit loosely. It's kind of borrowing with the intent of, never really giving it back. It's kind of taking, and it's considered to be on some level somewhat of a reparation, if you will, for the slavery. But the point is simple. The point is that every Jew had dozens of wagon loads or donkey loads, in the way that our sages put it, of wealth. And so the question is, why the need to talk about slavery? There's no slavery. Who came on hard times in the desert and needed to become a slave that now we need to talk about the laws of slavery? Who was a slave? Who was impoverished? Every Jew had plenty of wealth, had plenty of money, right? Why they need to talk about slavery? There's no context here. Let me explain further what I mean. When the Jews left Egypt, they took the gold and silver. In addition to taking the gold and silver, at the time of the splitting of the sea, the gold and diamonds and jewelry, the gemstones, the gemstones, washed up on the shore after the Egyptians drowned. All of the jewelry that the Egyptians were wearing, the bling, right? The necklaces, the bracelets, etc., all washed up on shore, and the Jews collected that as well. And they're in a desert, and they have money. How you blowing through money in 7 weeks? Right after Sinai, what, the Jews are like, oh man, I fell on hard times. I was like, I put all my money down on Patrick Mahomes. I mean, in what context? If you're not a football fan, don't worry. In what context? Don't worry, I didn't. In what context? You got to go with Brady. Kidding. In what context are they losing all their money? In what context are they impoverished now that, folks, just in case, here are the laws of slavery in case you need to know. What is the context in which this is necessary to talk about? It's not necessary. Everyone, plenty of dough. Listen. This is before Reddit and before Wall Street bets and before GameStop and before the stock market. This is before all of that stuff. So who was blowing all their cash, all their newfound cash on a bad investment? Man, I invested in this cactus, and the next thing you know, boom, I lost everything. What kind of loss is happening? What kind of slavery is necessary? It doesn't make sense. The whole thing doesn't make sense. Now, if you want to see the sources that talk about the wealth of the Jews, let's take a look at the text as I will share them with you all, because, of course, we love to read the text inside. Take a look at what it says in the book of Exodus. You know what, Adina Malka, jump in on this, please. Don't forget to unmute. You know the drill. Text number 2 from the Torah. This is straight up scripture.
And the children of Israel fulfilled Moses' instruction and borrowed from the Egyptians silver objects, golden objects, and garments. God gave the people favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians lent them, and the Jews emptied out Egypt.
And lent is, lent, sort of lent, gave, whatever. Basically, the money, a lot of the wealth was transferred at that point to the Jews. They emptied out Egypt. And then I mentioned about the splitting of the sea and the gemstones. Take a look at text number 3. Who's next? Richard, please jump in, if you will, on text number 3.
When the Jewish people left Egypt, Paro pursued them. Paro adorned his armies with diamonds and gems. When they reached the Red Sea and drowned, all the diamonds and gems rose to the surface and washed up on the shore, where they abandoned. For days, the Jews made their way to shore and collected the valuables.
And by the way, these diamonds and gems, we know where they are today. We have kits ready to go for Purim and Passover, and we're going to do a jewelry workshop. We have the originals. Join us, join Donna and myself, February 22nd, March 22nd for these incredible workshops. Information on our website, intownjewishacademy.org. Second commercial. We are doing very well. Look, I talked about video production. The next thing you know, I'm rolling into infomercials here. All right, so what happens? The Jews in text 2 took the gold and silver out of Egypt. In text 3 tells us that when the splitting of the sea happened, they emptied all the diamonds and jewelry and gems. The Jews had plenty of geld, to the point that there's no rational need to even speak about the whole context of slavery. Again, I want to give you a context that I gave in DPP, that stands for Daily Power Parsha. That famous scene in the movie where the fellow goes to the restaurant and orders a bunch of stuff and then can't pay for it for whatever reason. So what do they tell you to do if you can't pay for the food in the restaurant? Yeah, wash the dishes. So in a sense, that's what slavery is in the Jewish context. Jewish slavery would mean somebody became impoverished and they can't pay back the debt. Wash the dishes. That's essentially what it is. But that's only if a person has become impoverished. There's no other context that makes it moral or legal in Jewish law. So there's no poverty here. There was no poverty. So right after Sinai, you need to talk about the laws of Jewish slaves and how whether the debt's paid or not, they go free in the 7th year. Why are we talking about this? Who's impoverished? Who's going to become a slave? It's not an imminent need. There's no imminent need to talk about. It's not an imminent conversation. It's not relevant. Are you with me in question number 2? Okay, that's my second question. 2 out of 4. I'm going to recap the first 2 questions. Question 1 is, it's insensitive. It's a trigger. Why talk about slavery to a bunch of former slaves? Like, what? Talk about something else right after Sinai. Something uplifting. Number 1. Number 2, it's not relevant. It's not relevant. Question number 3. You ready for this one? These questions keep on coming. The next question is, number 3 is, not only is it insensitive, not only is it not relevant, it is superfluous. It is extra. Why do I say that? Because we have a tradition that you may or may not be familiar with. It's brought down in the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud says that when the Jews were still in Egypt, listen to this, when the Jews were still in Egypt before the Exodus, God had told Moses to tell the people about the Jewish perspective on slavery. I'm going to share this text with you, and we are going to read this inside together. This is the content of text number 4. Susan, would you like to read? Jump on in.
Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yitzchak, said, "Which commandment does the passage refer to when it reads, 'And God spoke to Moses and Aaron and instructed them about the children of Israel'? It was about the mitzvah to liberate their slaves."
Take a look at this. It's such a daring interpretation. The Jerusalem Talmud jumps in on this and says, when God speaks to Moses and Aaron, this is still in Egypt prior to the Exodus. And this is even prior to the plagues. This is before the plagues began. This is when God was first recruiting Moses and Aaron on the mission to speak to Pharaoh, let my people go, etc. Before it went down. So it says that God commanded them about the children of Israel. What does that mean? God instructed them about. So the Talmud says God gave them an instruction to give the Jewish people. And what was the instruction? About the mitzvah of liberating their own slaves. Now, we could ask questions on this piece of Talmud, but what comes out from this is that the Jewish people had already heard about the mitzvah, about liberating slaves in the 7th year, in the sabbatical year. They had already heard about this mitzvah already in Egypt. Why the need to reiterate it here, and especially why they need to do so the first mitzvah right after the giving of the Torah at Sinai, after last week's Torah portion, the opening mitzvah has to be about liberating slaves. It's superfluous. It's unnecessary because we already got it, the Jews already received that message already in Egypt. That's our third question. Again, question 1 is, it's insensitive to talk about slaves and slavery. Number 2, it's irrelevant. No one needed to be, there was no need for anyone to deal with these laws because no one was impoverished. Question 3 is, even for informational purposes, they already had this information prior. They were told this information already living in Egypt. And now we're going to ask our 4th question. Our 4th and final question is, there's one more text. Before we get to the 4th question, let's do one more text. Text number 5. This is from Jeremiah. This is from the book of Jeremiah. Take a look. Donna of Donna Jewelry, please read text number 5, Jeremiah 34.
The word of God came to Jeremiah saying, "So says the God of Israel, I made a covenant with your fathers on the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves, saying, every man at the end of 7 years, release your Jewish brother who has been sold to you. When he has served you for 6 years, give him his freedom."
Again, thank you. Again, clearly we have a source that says that God already in Egypt, or, on the day they left Egypt, already gave them that commandment about releasing slaves. And therefore, why is it relevant here in the beginning of this Torah portion, right after the experience at Sinai, to reiterate this mitzvah, this obligation to release slaves? It seems to be completely superfluous. and unnecessary? That is question number 3. That's just from an additional source. And the last question we're going to ask is a question that we love to ask. And it's a question really that is universal whenever we study Torah. And that is, what's the message for us? What is it? What's the teaching? What is the message that you and I can take and walk away with from this conversation, especially given that the conversation is about slavery, which we live in 2021, and slavery is not a thing that anyone thinks, I mean, hopefully not, right, is at all a good thing, at all a decent thing, at all a good idea, moral, justified, at all. It's none of the above. It's not a good idea. It's not moral. It's not justified. So the whole conversation becomes a little bit like, maybe we're just in general uncomfortable with this topic in 2021, reading it at all, let alone, forget about juxtaposition, just like, what does it mean? And how do we understand it? And what's the message? What's the timeless message? If it's in Torah, it must have a timeless message for us. So what could there possibly be? What timeless message could there possibly be in a discussion about slavery in the Torah? Again, specifically given the fact that this is the first mitzvah in the opening portion right after the experience at Sinai. All right. So these are the questions that we need to explore. Question number 1, at the core, that's one question. The question is, why are we discussing this mitzvah? The first part of the first way to ask it is, it's insensitive. The second way is, it's unnecessary. They weren't slaves. The third point is, it's superfluous. It was already told to them. And the fourth point is, what's the message? What's the timeless message? How do we understand this in 2021? So I will tell you right off the bat that although I'm asking these questions tonight in our class, I'm not the one to come up with these questions. These questions have been asked over the centuries, over the millennia. They've been asked by many scholars and biblical commentaries and rabbis, and there are many answers that have been given to these questions. Tonight, this is what we're going to do. I had 4 questions. We're gonna have 4 answers. 3 that come from classic, traditional Jewish commentaries, and the 4th, which comes from the mystical teachings of Torah, as we'll see, the mystical, Kabbalistic, Hasidic, Chabad, if you will, perspective on this question. So 3 classic answers, and then we're going to bring a 4th. These answers will range from the historical to the emotional to the psychological, and then ultimately to the spiritual. We're going to go through all of them and understand them and see how each one adds another layer. There's 70 facets to Torah study. We're going to see at least 4 tonight, and hopefully walk away with not only an understanding of what this mitzvah was all about and why it's the opening of our Torah portion, but also what it means for us in 2021 living in a free country. What the message is for us. And I think you'll be blown away by the deeper message. We're going to begin our answer phase with the commentary of Ramban, Nachmanides. Nachmanides offers a very interesting perspective. I'm going to share my screen with you. And actually, right before I do that, let me just give you a quick hakdam, a quick introduction to Nachmanides. Nachmanides is going to say, we're going to read it inside in a moment, in just a minute, but quickly. Nachmanides is going to focus on the fact that the emancipation of slaves that the Torah provides for at the beginning of our Torah portion, 6 years of work, in the 7th year, there's freedom, that touches on a central biblical theme of 6 days, of 6 being associated with work and 7 being associated with emancipation, right? Like 6 days we work and the 7th day is a day of rest, Shabbat. So we find similar cycles of 6 and 7 within the fabric of the universe, and a similar cycle also within the slavery. Six years of work, and the 7th year is the slave goes free. And he says this is why it's the opening of our Torah portion. It's because it's such a central theme, if you will, that it touches on the big ideas as well as the Exodus, which we'll see in a moment. But that's the introduction. Let's see it now inside. Let's take a look at text number 6, Nachmanides' answer. Let's see who's next. Ray, are you up to reading? All right, please unmute and please retext number 6 for the benefit of us all. Tell me if you have a little unmute. Yeah, you got it.
It begins with
Yeah,
the Torah begins.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
The Torah begins with a commandment concerning the Jewish slave, because the slave's liberation in the 7th year is reminiscent of our liberation from Egypt, mentioned in the first of the 10 Commandments. It is also reminiscent of creation, as is the Sabbath, since the slave's 7th year is like a Sabbath of sorts. It is when he is freed from serving his master. The slave has an additional liberation date in the Jubilee, the year that follows the 7th set of 7 years, because the 7th was selected by God to represent freedom in terms of days, years, and the Jubilee. Thus, because of their distinction and because the laws of slavery parallel important themes of creation, they were chosen as the introductory mitzvah.
So thank you. So Ramban Nachmanides is addressing our question, literally our question. Why is this the introductory mitzvah of Mishpatim, of this week's Torah portion? Right after Sinai, the next thing we're talking about slaves. Why are we talking about, like, who's thinking about slaves? So Ramban says 2 points. Number one, it's reminiscent of our liberation from Egypt, which is mentioned in the first of the 10 Commandments. If you recall, commandment number 1 of the 10 was, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, right? God introduces himself as the God that liberated the Jews from Egypt. So right after the 10 Commandments, God says, I liberated you. You make sure to liberate your own slaves at least every 7 years, right? I liberated you. You liberate your slaves. That's one connection. And he says the second connection is, look, creation, God's role in creation is a central Jewish theme. And what is God's role in creation? How does God create? 6 days of creation, 7th day of rest. We parallel that in the laws of slaves, 6 years of work. The 7th is the sabbatical, the Shabbat, a year in which that work comes to an end and that term of slavery comes to an end. And thus, the laws, the opening laws of our Torah portion that seem to be randomly talking about slavery, emancipating slaves, it's not so random. It touches on the theme of the first of the 10 Commandments, which is Exodus and liberation of slaves. And it also talks about creation and acknowledging God in creation, that we only work for 6, but on the 7th, there is a freedom and liberation. That's Ramban. Let me check in with you if you like that answer. Do you like it? Make sense, sort of? Yeah? David's like, listen, it makes sense, right? It makes sense. Essentially, he's saying it's not
I think there's better.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. Listen, that's why we have 4 answers tonight. This is the first of 4. But it's a classic. It's important to know what classic commentators are saying. And this is, Ramban is certainly, when you talk about classic Torah commentaries, I mean, he's a Rishon, he's an early biblical commentary, and this is what he offers. Okay, to be honest, I agree with David, because we didn't really answer all of the questions, right? We didn't answer, if you look at all 4 questions, I don't want to drill back into the questions, but it's not necessarily answering all 4 questions. It maybe answer 1 of the questions or 2 of the questions, but it's not really addressing all of the points that we raised before. Nonetheless, this is Ramban's answer. Let's take a look at the next answer. The next answer we're going to share is from Ibn Ezra, or the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra, again, classic biblical commentary from medieval times, one of the Rishonim, and this is what he writes. Let's ask Adina Malka. Did you read tonight? Yes? How short is my attention? How short is my memory? All right, let's ask Susan. Susan, please, if you will, unmute yourself and jump into the Ibn Ezra, text 7, again, addressing our question.
Okay. There is nothing more difficult in the human experience than to be bonded to a fellow human. Therefore, the Torah begins with the laws of slavery.
Thank you. So the Ibn Ezra, and this is a short excerpt, so I need to elaborate on what he's saying. He's addressing really the first question that we asked, which is about the sensitivity question. He says the following, that there's nothing more difficult for a human being than to be bonded to a fellow human. Bonded here doesn't mean like you have a good friend. That's not a difficult experience. Bonded in the sense of enslaved, being shackled by, being imprisoned by, or to another human being. So he says that is a very, very difficult human condition. For a human being to be enslaved by another is tremendously difficult. He says, therefore, the Torah begins with the laws of slavery. And what are the laws of slavery? About emancipating one's slaves in the 7th year, that it's not a long-term thing. It's not a forever thing. It may be out of circumstance. And by the way, slavery was never forced. It was only something that essentially happened by choice because of a necessity. But it's still a difficult situation. And the Jews then could empathize with that challenge. And therefore, the Torah wants to teach us and wants to teach these individuals who had worn those shoes, who had been slaves. Right? The Torah says that now as you experience your own freedom, make sure that you don't keep another human being enslaved like you were enslaved. Rather, in the 7th year, in that objective 7 years, it could be sooner than 7 years. It could be the next year's year number 7, because again, it's not your count. It's an objective count of 7 years that keeps on cycling through. So every 7 years in the cycle, your slave is going free. And that, he says, on the contrary, that's not triggering to the former slave. That's not insensitive to the former slave. That's actually, what's the word I'm looking for? That's actually soothing to the former slave, to the individual who knows firsthand the horrors of slavery, to tell them that when a situation arises, that somebody else needs to put themselves in a vulnerable spot, that you and I are never allowed to take advantage of that, that there's always an outlet, there's always an escape hatch, there's always a way to get out. That is not triggering. That's not, negative. That's a positive. That's something that a former slave could truly appreciate. If anyone could appreciate this law, it would be the Jews who had just gotten out themselves of slavery. And therefore, the Ibn Ezra says, what is the first national communication after the Big Ten? I mean, the Big Ten commandments are like, the Big Ten, but what's the first national conversation? It's about freeing slaves. You were slaves. You know what it's like. Never have long-term slavery. It's not moral. It's not okay. It's not divinely sanctioned. You have to liberate the slaves if it's necessity for a few years, whatever. But after that, done. And that should, because of the empathy, that should resonate for the entire nation. Does that make sense what I just said? Yes? Sort of? Yeah? Okay. That's the Ibn Ezra's opinion. That's his perspective on why this mitzvah is the first mitzvah. That's, as a nation, that's the first commandment we got after the Big Ten. So we have two answers so far. Ramban says this mitzvah is big. It touches on Exodus and it touches on creation. So therefore it's the first one. Okay. The Ibn Ezra says it's the mitzvah that the people really needed to hear. Having been slaves, the first communication is never again. Never again are we going to do this to anybody else. We're not going to do this to each other. That's not how we roll. Again, if it's a necessity that somebody works full time for a certain amount of time to pay off a debt, that's one thing, and that's a choice. But not long-term. And by the way, if you recall from text 1, from the original verses, if the slave is enjoying the experience and says, I want to stay. Okay, fine, but until the objective 50th year, and then it's for sure done, even if the slave wants to, because there's no long-term or forever status to slavery in Judaism. And this resonated, this really resonated within the heart and soul of those people. That's the second approach. Approach number 3. Again, we have 4 approaches total, including the Hasidic mystical approach. This is the third classic opinion, which takes a completely different approach. Okay, and I need to introduce this before we get into it. Okay, this is an interesting thing. The 10 Commandments. Last week, right? Talked about 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments are 10 out of 613 commandments in total. So they are just 10 out of a much larger number of commandments found in the Torah. Yet, these are the 10 Commandments. What makes them the 10 Commandments? Why are they any more special than the other 603? Now, I know what you're thinking. It's special because God communicated them to us at Sinai. Fine, but why these 10? Why these 10? Here's one perspective on it, and it's going to tie back into our conversation, but a moment to put all the pieces, to lay them out, and then draw the connection. So give me a second. Why are they the 10 Commandments? So here's something fascinating. Commentaries point out, and I may have mentioned this I don't remember if I did in Torah studies, but I did in another class, maybe DPP. I definitely mentioned this sometime last week, that the 10 Commandments are not just individual mitzvot, they are categories of mitzvot that contain a bunch of other commandments. I'm going to say that one more time. Each of the 10 commandments is not just an individual one mitzvah, it's actually a larger category that contains many of the other mitzvot inside, which means that you can fit all of the other 603 commandments in one of those 10 categories. Does that make sense what I just said? All of the other mitzvot of the Torah, aside from the 10 commandments, can fit into one of the categories of the 10 commandments. The Abarbanel. The Abarbanel. You know the song that was composed about the Abarbanel? Abarbanel. Abarbanel. Okay, the Abarbanel, he has an incredible take on this mitzvah that opens up our Torah portion. He says, right after we got the 10 commandments, God followed up with Moses to tell us the subcategories. You hear what I just said? Right after we got the categories, immediately in Mishpatim, our Torah portion, we have a follow-up with the details that go into the categories. And he says, if you look at Mishpatim, our Torah portion, it's got all of the mitzvot follow a pattern of the second half of the 10 commandments, 2 tablets, right? The second tablet, commandments 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, those 5 commandments. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false testimony, and do not covet, right? Those 5, again, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false testimony, and do not covet. Those 5 mitzvot, commandments, of the 10 commandments, again, are general categories, and the specifics of what's included in those categories are what our Torah portion lays out. And what's the first mitzvah? What's the first mitzvah? About not harming slaves, about not keeping slaves long-term, about releasing slaves in the 7th year, right? It's about compassion toward those that are working for you in quote slavery. It's not treating them as a slave, but having compassion. And you know what the message is? We're going to read this inside. You know what the message is? That slavery, without Torah's laws, without this embedded emancipation, you know what it's like? Murder. Slavery without emancipation, like what the Egyptians did to us, that slavery is tantamount to commandment number 6. And the Abarbanel continues to trace all of the opening mitzvot of this week's Torah portion are the subcategories of murder. And then the next few mitzvot in our Torah portion are the subcategory of theft. And then the next ones are the subcategory of adultery, etc. He goes through all of them and he explains how these are subcategories of the larger categories. But what's the first mitzvah? Slavery. What's slavery? It is within the category of murder. In other words, personal harm, harming another human being. Because what is murder? Murder is harming someone else physically. Well, what's slavery without emancipation? What is slavery? It's harming someone physically. Let's read this inside. I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to read this text myself. Text 8. God gave his nation 10 brief commandments. But since they were unable to hear the subsets of these commandments directly from God, God had to instruct Moses to teach them these laws, which are clear subsets of the 10 commandments. He therefore opened, and these are the laws that you shall place before them the word and ve'ela mishpatim, and these are the laws. And implies that these laws are a continuation of the 10 commandments because they are included in those commandments. A wise person knows that all these laws and more are contained in the 10 commandments. However, God illustrated his point with these laws and left the wise person to infer that the same applies to all the laws that the Torah would eventually elucidate. Just as it's clear that the opening mitzvot of our Torah portion are subcategories of the 10 commandments, so too as Torah continues to roll out all of the other mitzvot throughout the 5 books of Moses, they're all subcategories of the original 10 commandments. And to bring this to life, I have a chart here on page 85. Take a look at the chart. The first category commandment is murder. And here are the opening mitzvot of our Torah portion: the prohibition against slavery, or against slavery needing emancipation, because slavery is akin to a living death; injuring a parent, the prohibition against injuring a parent, which is again bodily harm; cursing a parent, which is again murder with words; kidnapping, killing a slave, scoring a person. These are the opening 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are the opening 6 mitzvot of our Torah portion, and they seem all over the place. One is about slavery, and one is about parents, and one is about kidnapping, and one is about an ox, your ox, killing another person, God forbid. Random laws. And Abarbanel says, random? I think not. They are all subcategories of murder, because what is the prohibition against murder? It's about harming someone else's body. It's about harming somebody else's person, harming them as a human being. You harm them through slavery. You can harm by injuring a parent. You can harm by cursing someone with words. You can harm by kidnapping. You can harm by killing a slave. You can harm by your property, your ox, harming a person. These are all forms of bodily harm and injury, and all fall into the subset of murder. And that's how he explains the opening verses, the opening mitzvot of our Torah portion, which explains why the Torah portion opens with slavery, because slavery falls under this category. But once again, are we fully satisfied with this answer of Abarbanel? Yes or no? Does Abarbanel, let me ask you, does Abarbanel explain why slavery is the first, or why it's amongst the first? Are you with me in the distinction? Abarbanel just explains why this is a subset of murder, which is the first general category that the Torah chooses, that God chooses to drop in on. But it doesn't explain specifically why slavery is the first of those 6. Why couldn't it be the second, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, or the sixth? So therefore, we have classic answers, 3 of these classic answers, but each of them still leaves us wanting for more. And now we're going to get into the more. You wanted more? Well, I just told you did. But now that you want more, because I'm sure you're all agreeing, because no one's saying anything to disagree, especially because I have you all muted. So therefore, we are going to jump into a deeper perspective, right? And what is the deeper perspective? Let's roll. This is the mystical Hasidic approach, and you'll hear the language, and it'll sound familiar as far as a totally different way of looking at the world in Torah. Let's do this. We just came from Sinai. We just got the mitzvot. And now the question is not will we do them or not. That's not the question. Of course, we're going to do them. The question is, what do they mean to us? What do they mean to you? What do they mean to me? Let me explain what I mean by what does it mean. What I mean is it something we do in our spare time? Is it something we do on the side? Is it something we do in addition to our identity? In other words, I am me. I have my hobbies. I have my job. I have my family. In addition, on occasion, I also do these rituals and study this book and do these things and whatever on the side. It's one of the things that I do. But as far as who I am a human being. Otherwise, I am a mensch. I'm a human being that has all these things. Plus, I do these Jewish things. Is that what Judaism is? That's one model. But here's another model. And at Dina Malka, you'll recognize this because we spoke about this either last week or the week before. Judaism, that would be Judaism as a religion. Judaism, the religion is, it tells me certain things that I should do in addition to who I am. But then there's another perspective. Judaism is not just a hobby on the side or something that we do when we go to shul or something that we do when we pray or when we do a mitzvah. No. Judaism is what we live and breathe. Judaism, like Calvin Klein once said, is an obsession. Right? Was Obsession the fragrance by Calvin Klein? I don't remember. Yeah, okay, fine. All right. Anyway, sorry for checking in on my reference here, but sometimes I need the extra assist. So here's the point.
Yes.
Thank you. Is it a hobby? Is it something that we do in addition to who we are? Or is it our identity? Is it an obsession? You probably know where I'm going with this. Judaism, Torah is not meant to be. It's not meant to be an aside from who we are. It's not meant to be in addition to who we are. It's meant to be who we are. So that Torah values don't just come up once a day, twice a day, on the weekends, but we're constantly living with the values of Torah, even in areas that look very mundane and normal, unusual. One second. Even in areas that look very mundane, and we're pumping gas into our car. Is that a disconnected moment? Is that a mundane moment? Or is that an opportunity to also, on some level, I'll let you figure out how to do this, but on some level also to connect with God and to be a Jew, to be a Yid, right? When we eat a meal, is it, well, I'm eating now and then later on, maybe I'll do a mitzvah thing about God? Or is the meal also a time to think about God? You know the answer, right? Judaism is not meant to sit on the shelf somewhere. It's not meant for the weekends. It's not meant for mornings and evenings. Judaism is meant to fill our lives. And this is the opening mitzvah of the Torah. God says to us, I just gave you Torah at Sinai, and I want you to be subjugated to Torah in a good way. I want you to be all in to Torah. I want you to be all in your entire identity to the point, listen to this, to the point that you have no space. You have no space left to be enslaved to another human being. You need to be, one second, you need to be all in on Judaism, on Torah, mitzvot, all in to the point that you don't have the time or the energy to be a slave to the man. You're enslaved to this guy, to that person. Are you kidding me? Who has the time? Yeah, you're doing some work for someone, fine. That's your side gig. The main gig is with God. And so it's not a numbers game. It's not about hours of the day. It's a mindset. Where are you? Where are you? What's your identity? It's not you, it's me, right? What's my identity? Is my identity the job? Is my identity the boss? Is my identity Hollywood? Is my identity Wall Street? Is my identity Tesla? What's my identity? Or is my identity HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Eibusher, God Almighty? And after Sinai, God says there is no longer slavery. Yeah, you might work for 6 years, whatever. That will never be your identity. And why won't it be your identity? Because in year 7, you are no longer there. So even when you're there, that's not your identity. Never becomes who you are, because who you are is a Yid, is a Jew. Who you are is someone who is God's person. You're on the God squad, baby. You have no time for any mod squad. You're on the God squad. And that's why, going to drop some answers now for the questions we asked. That is why, even though the Jews were told in Egypt to emancipate their slaves at such point, whenever that would happen, that was a human rights issue. Your human rights are being violated. Never do that again. After Sinai, it's not about human rights anymore. Different conversation. We heard the story about human rights and freedom and emancipation. That we got in Egypt already. What are we getting now, Mishpatim, in our Torah portion? Different message. It's not about human rights. It's about divine identities. God says, you never are allowed to own a slave. Yeah, they might work for you for 6 years. You don't own someone because they can't be owned by you, because they're already owned by God in a good way, right? That person is already responsible to God. And there's no time and there's no space to be subjugated to the man, to another human being. That's the message of our opening of our Torah portion. Let's take a look. Do we have a text here?
Rabbi.
1 second. Yeah, Ray, go ahead.
We heard that where are you back in creation?
Yeah.
How do you relate one to the other or not? When God
I'm not going to
says,
relate it to right now, because at Sinai there was a different call. Ayeka, where are you, is to Adam in the Garden of Eden after the sin, which could have a different context, different connotation. What I'm trying to explain tonight is that when God revealed himself at Sinai, if you and I were standing there, there's 2 ways you could hear that message. All right, God wants me, in addition to all my other stuff, to check off all these boxes, to have a checklist of responsibilities that I need to do every single day. Cool, I'll do that, God. No problem. You want it? I'll do it. That's one approach. The other approach is, God has given me a new identity. I have a new reality. I have a new purpose. I have a new identity. This is the new me. The new me is someone who's living a divine life, someone who's living in service of God, someone who's living with divine purpose and a divine mission. And that is my totality. And so, yeah, I may also work for someone. I may also have a job, a day job, or whatever it is. And that may take a lot of time and a lot of energy and some brain space as well. That may, but that's not who I am. And the Torah specifies that with the law of slavery. The first thing after Sinai is, you are never enslaved to human work. You are never enslaved to a human being. You are never subjugated to culture, society. That's not who you are. Who are you? You are a person with a divine soul that has a divine mission and a divine responsibility, and you have a divine calling. And you are so much greater than all of that other stuff, all of those other distractions. This is the message of the opening of our parasha, the opening of our Torah portion. What better message to start off with right after Sinai is the message of identity. Now that you got the Torah, kind of like the Super Bowl ad. Remember the old ads? I don't know if they still do it, right? I'm going to date myself now. What was his name on the 49ers? What was that quarterback?
Joe Montana.
Thank you. Yeah. Joe Montana, you just won the Super Bowl. What are you going to do next? I'm going to Disney, right? That's the question after Sinai. You just got the Torah. What are you going to do next? What am I going to do next? I'm going to serve God. And that means I'm not serving another human being. I don't have time. I don't have space. I don't have the energy. Not going to happen. I may work, but not serving, because serving is only for God. That is my identity. And so every 7 years, the Etch-a-Sketch shakes out and everything settles, and it's clear and realized that no one owns anybody else. No one can own, because we are all in service of God. And so in conclusion, as we stand here in 2020 and we reflect on the opening mitzvah of the Torah, the mitzvah of slavery, but it's not about having a slave, it's about emancipating slavery. Let us embrace this mission and let us emancipate all of those shackles that we might sometimes believe in, all of those fetters, all of those knots that we sometimes tie ourselves in, and all of those things that we anchor ourselves to that are not higher, that are lower. Let us take this opportunity. Parshas Mishpatim, my bar mitzvah portion. Let's take this opportunity to undo the knots, to unanchor, or whatever it is, the anchor, to unshackle the fetters, and to let ourselves free. Free not from all responsibility, but free from serving that which ought not be served. Free to live our higher purpose and our higher meaning in service of God and making this world the place that it can be. I thank you for joining me tonight. Let's embrace the mission. Let's let ourselves go free, and let us embrace the higher mission of our lives. Thank you, and I wish you all an Erev Tov, a good evening. May this message resonate for all of us and inspire all of us in our lives. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you. What do
All
you
right.
want for your bar mitzvah?
Now I'm on to take questions, comments.
Something to drink?
Stay on if you'd like, and you can ask away. A few things to mention. And that is, we have some very important upcoming events. I mentioned the jewelry workshop, gorgeous Purim theme, Jewish holiday theme jewelry. Check it out, intownjewishacademy.org. We have a brand new series, the Kabbalah of the future, some future ideas, mystical ideas that we're going to be looking at that is absolutely incredible. So join me for that. We have an art workshop, painting at home workshop that's about to go up, hopefully in the next few days. And then, of course, we have a very special event with David's mom, who is a survivor and an author and a speaker. She's going to share her experiences with us on March 14th. Please join us for that, an event called Faith and Fortitude. All right, let's jump in. Questions and answers, or questions, and hopefully I'll be able to respond. Richard.
Really, this is to me, this is the elephant in the room, and it's another class that I don't think I can answer right now. But that pertains to Jews having Jewish slaves. What about to me, it's never talked about only non-Jewish slaves. There's a difference, and why would we want to own anyone? So I know it's a long discussion, but I've never.
It's not actually so long. It's not so long, and it's not taboo, and it's not an elephant in the room. The commentaries discuss it, and I'm happy to share it with you, and it makes a lot of sense. The commentaries tell us that the way the ancient civilizations held slaves was absolutely horrific. If you and I think that slavery from 150 years ago or whatever was brutal, how about slavery from 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago? Can you imagine what that was like? Can you imagine? I can't imagine. But it was absolutely horrendous and horrific. And our sages tell us that slaves, Judaism has a specific laws regarding slaves. And that is, you have to treat the slave like a member of your family. You have to give the slave to eat what you eat. You can't not subpar food. Sleep on a bed like your bed. If you have only one pillow, you have to give it to your slave. Basically teaches us how to treat another human being with respect and dignity, even if they work for you full time. That's what a slave is. And so the commentaries point out that slaves would run away from other countries, neighboring countries, to escape, to go where? To go where? To go to Israel and become a slave for the Jewish people. And they would beg, knocking on the doors, take me in as your slave and harbor me. Torah did not demand, right? Did not demand that we should then when settling, because when the owner of that slave would come to the Jew and say, you got my slave, and the Jew would then have to pay off the owner. You want to ask, if we're asking a question, let's think about the practical scenario, right? The owner would come to the Jew and say, you got my slave, and the Jew would shell out money. Would the Torah demand that a Jew spend the money and not get something in return and have to emancipate and liberate? That's already next level. The Torah doesn't demand that. Now, the Torah expectation is that we get there on our own. But does the Torah mandate it? No. Does that make sense? The Jews would not buy slaves from the other nations. It would be a situation where the slave was running away, and then a deal was made for the betterment of the slave's life. So Torah does not say that it's a tzedakah fund that you have to shell out money to save the world and then emancipate everybody. Why? Although that's an ideal, that's not an obligation. I think we have to differentiate between a mitzvah and a good deed. A mitzvah is not a good deed. A mitzvah is an obligation, a binding obligation. There's no binding obligation, right, to ransom and pay the ransom and free everybody in the world, right? For our own people, there is a mitzvah, there's an obligation, but it's not an obligation for the whole world. Is it a good deed? Absolutely. Should it be done? Sure. Is it an obligation? Not on that level.
If in fact,
does what I'm saying makes sense?
Yeah. If in fact they retained the slave, was it customary to buy him, to shell out the money to the original owner? Was that customary?
Yes.
So that's not a mitzvah.
Yes.
That's a good deed. And the question.
No. It's not a good deed. It's business.
Okay, business.
They would demand the slave back.
Yeah.
How would you save the slave?
So he would ransom the slave. I mean, the Jew would
The slave would run away. The owner would find out where the slave is, and the owner would have to pay the owner. The Jew would have to pay the owner.
To keep, yeah. Okay.
That's the way it worked. And
And
so
if
the
the
question
slave-
is, does the Torah demand that you come up with the money, pay the money, and then free the slave? Is that an obligation? It's not an obligation. I need to share with you now what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory wrote. Rabbi Sachs writes that the Torah does not always tell us the end game. The Torah often provides for us a path for us to get the values and get there on our own. One such example is with regard to slavery. The Torah doesn't abolish slavery right then and there, because perhaps it wasn't feasible at that point in time based on societal structures to do so. But you know what the Torah does say? The Torah tells us that human beings are created in the image of God. The Torah tells us that every human life is valuable. The Torah tells us that slavery is wrong and slavery is abhorrent. The Torah tells us about the value of paying, like I said before, paying the ransom or paying off owners of slaves when they are in difficult situations and positions. Torah tells us about Jewish slaves, about emancipating them every 7 years. You know what the message is? The message is ultimately that we should come to a place to realize what God really wants. You know what that is?
Slaves.
No slaves.
Slavery, sure. Yeah.
No slaves. This is the long march to freedom. Like Nelson Mandela wrote a book called The Long March to Freedom. This is the long march. You know, God has time. God has time. God is eternal. And so God knows that we're not going to get it right away, but that if given the right information, slowly, humankind will get there. And in 2021, more than ever before in human history, more people on planet Earth get it. More people get it. Not everybody gets it. But more people than ever get this idea. And where are these seeds planted? In Torah. And so everyone asks, Torah sanctioning slaves. That's one way to look at it. Or you can say Torah is planting the seeds to get us on board with the concept of being abhorred, finding it abhorrent to have slaves, that we should on our own abolish slavery. That's the other way to look at it. And that's what Rabbi Sachs shares. All right. Questions, comments?
This is Yaakov. I'm sorry, I don't have video. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, so it's very apropos for this time because, we think of slavery as something that happened in the past and it's gone now. With all the human trafficking going on and child slavery, there is more humans in slavery right now than ever in the history of the earth.
Wow.
So I was wondering, since, you know, child trafficking is probably the most tragic and heart-wrenching and destroys lives, you know, what do we as Jews have as a responsibility to participate in these social issues?
I mean, I don't know if there's a question. I mean, as a human being, as a moral human being, we have an absolute obligation to do everything in our power to end that horror. Absolutely. I don't think it's a unique Jewish obligation, although certainly it's within the umbrella of Jewish values and the very values at the beginning of this week's Torah portion. But I would say it's a universal human obligation, part of law and order and justice and not abusing each other, that every human being do whatever we can to stop it. There's no question. There's absolutely no question about it. It's horrific. And again, I'm going to say this again, probably for the third or fourth or maybe fifth time. When the parasha begins, the Torah portion begins by talking about a Jewish slave for 6 years, that is not what we are talking about when we talk about slavery. When you and I think about slavery or human trafficking, that is not at all in the same ballpark. It is not in the same planet as what the Torah is talking about. It's not in the same universe. Torah is talking about a person who is a live-in, working in your home, who has a place to sleep in your home, who's working not 24/7, they're obviously sleeping, they're working, and you're not giving them menial activities, you're not giving them purposeless activities, you're giving them work around the house, and they have a responsibility, and you treat them like a mensch. The moment a hand is lifted, this week's Torah portion says, the moment a slave is touched, they're free. It's not in the same league as kidnapping and human trafficking, any of that. It's not the same conversation. And for us to conflate the two is twisting Torah, it's perverting Torah, and it's not at all. So your question is, what about human trafficking? What do we say about that? You don't have to look to Mishpatim for that. It's not in our Torah portion even. Our Torah portion talk about when you're treating a slave wonderfully like a member of the family, you still say, my fellow, you got to serve God, and out of my house, you got to build a home for God instead of working for me 24/7, so to speak. That's the message of our Torah portion. Human trafficking is abhorrent and it has to be stopped. It's not limited to this Torah portion. That's a universal human value, Torah value across the board. I hope that makes sense. But for us to think that Judaism originally sanctioned it, but then said only for 6 years, that is not at all. You have a question, Ali?
What if someone steals something and the person who got stolen from doesn't have anything that the slave could do?
Well, then you got to find something. I don't know. It's a good question. I was asking, what if you have no work for the slave to do, the person to do? All right. I don't know. Whatever. So they can help you. I don't know. I'm not sure. It's a good question. There's always something to do though. All right.
You can take a slave.
Put socks together. Put pairs of socks together.
But by the way, it has to be, the Torah says it's a biblical prohibition to give this person. I hate, see, you know what the problem is? Language. The translation is slave, and we say, oh, slave is slave. That's where the problem begins and ends. If we had a different word, then we wouldn't confuse the two.
Indentured servant.
Indentured servant is what it's really talking about. Yes.
Sure. Maybe a butler. Why not a butler? A live-in butler. Why not? A live-in butler.
First
Treat
mate.
Nicely. Huh?
First mate.
First mate. Yeah. Yeah. Why not? First mate. Yeah. A slave evokes all sorts of parallels that are not at all in the ballpark. Not at all. Whether Jewish or not Jewish. And that's what I was saying before. If a non-Jewish slave, the original slave, comes to a Jewish family, they're no longer a slave. They're a butler now. That's what I was saying before. It's a different reality. Judaism never allows for human abuses. Never. Under no umbrella is that allowed. Not for a second, let alone 6 years. Never. Not for a second.
So then the Jews.
So what are we talking about? One second. So what are we talking about? We're talking not about slavery. We're talking about something else that is translated, unfortunately, as slavery. It's a different thing though. So what's the point? The point is, yes, human trafficking has to be stopped. It's a human moral obligation. It has to be stopped. Our Torah portion is telling us, on top of all that, other messages like we spoke about, a message of purpose and how we live our lives and how we view our own commitments to God. But slavery and human trafficking, it's off the table. Of course we have to stop that. All right. Questions, comments?
Just 2 seconds. So are you saying in essence that when a non-Jew comes, begs to be let in, he is treated the same as a Jewish slave, pretty much?
Yes. Oh, I meant to say this before. I mentioned it, but let me circle back to this. The Torah prohibits giving a slave, again, using the word, giving this individual work that has no utility. Like you can't say, make me a cup of tea when you don't really need it. That's considered to be abuse. Making tea when you don't need it is abuse. That's the standard. That's the standard. I mean, our bosses in a company held to such a standard. Think about it. The Torah, that's the standard. You can't give even an easy task that's not needed to this person. That is the level of dignity and respect. And you know what? No one else knows. You can say, you can pretend that you really wanted it, but you changed your mind and you never didn't drink it. You know if you need it or not. You know why you said it. You know what your agenda is. And the Torah says, don't do that. Don't do that. It's wrong. Not got physical abuse is wrong. Making tea is wrong if you don't need it. It's a different state. Never need tea. I need tea.
Are they liberated after 6 years? A non-Jewish slave? Is it a lifetime?
No. There's no obligation. There's no obligation to liberate.
Okay.
Should it be done? Sure.
Okay.
Should it be done day one? Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Why not? But you're giving this person a better life, number one. And number two, it's recommended, but it's not obligated. Because a mitzvah is not just a good deed. A mitzvah in the Torah is an obligation. That's the difference. There's a standard. There's a different standard of what a mitzvah is. Mitzvah is an obligation. So do you have an obligation to not only pay for this person and then free? Again, ein l'davar sof. There's no end to that. Understand what the extent of this mitzvah would be? It would be making sure that every human being, a Jewish obligation to free every human being on planet Earth. That it's a specific Jewish obligation to do so. The Torah does not hold us to that standard. The Torah says in your family, yes, but in the whole world, yes, everybody should do it, but it's not a specific Jewish obligation to do that.
Okay. You've answered my question. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Follow-up question?
All right.
I got one more.
Yes, quickly, because I got to jump off.
Okay, quick. So I agree 100% that the Torah is bringing humanity from abhorrent behavior to pure spiritual viewpoint and orientation. So, and that it is absolutely 100% bringing us from inhumane treatment of slaves to humane treatment of slaves to non-slavery. And since it also took us from okay, no child sacrifices, that's bad. Try not to do that anymore. To, okay, we're going to do animal sacrifices now. To now, we're not sacrificing animals because we don't have a temple. We're making time sacrifices and prayer. Will we ever go back to animal sacrifices? Because it seems like we're becoming more spiritual. And in the Messianic era, why would we need to sacrifice the animal part of our soul if we've already been there, done that?
Excellent question. We got to save that for another class. Today is not about animal sacrifices, and we are out of time.
Okay.
All right, it's a good question. That's a part of it. There's a dispute amongst the commentaries about when Mashiach comes about animal sacrifices. It's a whole topic. Can't do it justice now on one foot, so we're going to save it for another time. Folks, thank you for joining. It's been an amazing experience for me. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. Laila Tov, have a good night, and let's all remember the main point of tonight's class, which is it's a commitment. It's a lifestyle, and let us find meaning in our divine service. Have a good night, everybody. Take care.